And of course, now we go from one Stanford Cardinal alum, Jessica Allister, here on the episode on the podcast version, to another Stanford alum. Speaking with, of course, Pac-12 network analyst, podcast host. She's become a regular on the show, but she's getting ready to call Pac-12 softball here alongside Amanda Freed this weekend for the Cal Washington series on the Pac-12 network. Speak of Jenna Becerra joins us here in the circle. Jenna, Pac-12 softball's here.
It's here. I am so excited. Like conference is the best. I feel like there's preseason, there's conference, there's postseason, but I really like when we get to have those rivalries and all that good stuff in play. So I'm excited.
It's also a busy time for you because you're now doing a lot of Pac-12 games on Pac-12 Network, but you're also still hosting your podcast. Tell us about the podcast because I know you got a new guest by the time people listen to this. In fact, those watching on the YouTube channel can see your shirt of your podcast. That's pretty
They
nice.
can, yes. I'm not trying to wear a shirt with my face on it necessarily. It just happens to be the podcast logo. So hopefully everyone realizes that. But yes, no, it's super exciting. Believe in Softball has been really fun. It's season 3. We have obviously folks in the Pac-12, but also all around the country on, including yourself, Elo. We've had you on the show before, which was fun. I think Victor's jealous. But I'm excited to keep that going while doing all the games and including some of the Stanford home games as well.
That's right. You got Tori Tyson, I believe, on this week's episode on your podcast.
Yes. Tori's this week, and then haven't recorded yet. We're recording tomorrow, but I can newsflash, breaking news here. Aubrey Monroe will be next week's guest.
Look at that, an exclusive here on In the Circle. I love it. You've had a banner year to start the year. You've had Jessica Mendoza on, who just made headlines, being part of the Dodgers now telecast. They're on coverage on LA Sportsnet over there in Los Angeles. And of course, Ramona Shelburne you've got. So we've had a lot of Stanford on this show, so we will save on the Stanford talk. But let's talk first about the series you're going to be a part of with Amanda Freed here, Washington and Cal. And I think it's a fascinating series because the Huskies, there were so many questions about them before the season. And then they came out really on fire, and then they've had some hiccups. Give me your thoughts on this series as you've kind of digest this as you get ready to call it with Washington there and Cal with Chelsea Spencer in her second year.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because if you look at, the rankings and the preseason polls and all of that good stuff, you could frame it as, okay, here's a top 25 ranked team, often top half of the top 25 ranked team in Washington, and pick to be at the top of the pack team versus an unranked team and a team that was picked to be in the bottom of the pack. But the thing about the Pac-12 is that stuff really doesn't matter when it comes to actually playing. And if you look at the idea of yes, Cal gets to host as well, that's always just somewhat of an advantage in terms of just psyche and feeling that kind of school spirit, especially now that fans are back this year. So that actually matters, unlike last season. So I think it's going to be interesting, though. I mean, Heather Tarr is one of the best of the best. Chelsea Spencer's energy, I think, is second to none. They're both alums of the schools that they now lead as a head coach. And I think that's incredibly special. So you can bring those rivalries even further into the mix. The Huskies in particular, I think they were touted really highly at first. They did really well at St. Pete Clearwater and early on, and the bats kind of quieted down, but then they started to come back a little bit. And I think it's one of those things where they're not framing it as hey, this is a rebuilding year. When you lose someone like Sis Bates, Taryn Atley was a key infielder for them as well. Morgan Flores was behind the dish for them for years. It's not a rebuilding year. It's a reloading year for them because they do actually have a lot of depth. Talking to Coach Tarr this week, they have a lot of depth and they actually have a lot of versatility, particularly in the circle. They have pitchers who can play other positions, who can hit as well, in addition to obviously one of the best pitchers in the country, who is Gabby Plain. But I'm actually really excited to talk with Amanda specifically about those pitchers and their versatility, given her along with Lisa Fernandez and some others were kind of the classic faces of that for softball for so many years. So that's exciting for me.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Obviously, you know about Gabby Plain, but then behind her, obviously, they've had a lot of different combinations that they've used there. Meanwhile, Cal, Chelsea Spencer, year 2, you're going to be there at Berkeley. You and Amanda will be. What's your thoughts on Chelsea Spencer, year 2 here at Cal?
I'm excited for her. They're already off to a much better start than last year, but she didn't have a fall. She didn't have any time really to get with her team and actually start to build the culture that they were going to build. She did her best, right? But they didn't have a lot of time together last year because of COVID. So this year, her actually getting that experience and getting a full quote unquote normal year with them, I think is going to be huge, especially because of that kind of alumni connection. That's another level of just respect and camaraderie that you can have as a coach with your players. And I would say, I've told her this before too. When I had her on Believe in Softball last year, I was like, you know what? Like, I never thought I'd say this, but I didn't think I could like someone from Cal this much, like being somebody from Stanford. It's not something I'm super used to, like off the gate, but I just really love her energy. She is a spark plug. And when I asked Coach Alistair, like, hey, what do you think of Chelsea being over there? And she was like thrilled for her last season. And then we didn't get to do that series together at Stanford last year with Cal because of some COVID stuff. But now just being able to see Chelsea really step into her own. And there are some exciting returners too. McKenna Smith is a huge asset for Cal offensively. And just, she's the only one that started every single game last year, because there was a lot of movement in the lineup because there was a lot of moving parts last season. This year, I think they finally get to settle down a little bit, and that's boded well for them so far.
An argument could be made that McKenna Smith is the best catcher in the Pac-12 and among the best catchers in the country. That I know there'll be some debate on that, but she's that good, isn't she?
She's good. I mean, when I talked to Chelsea about her last year, she was like, I think she could be our next All-American. Like, she is just tough as nails. Like, I think she told me a story where there's at one point she kind of jammed her finger or something in the middle of a game, and Coach Spencer was like, hey, are you all right? Do you need to be taken out? And she was like, no, I'm good, coach. Like, straight faced, like no hesitation. And Spencer said, like, yeah, that's kind of the moment I knew, like, okay, like this kid's tough. She knows how to compete. So I think that that's also infectious, and that the rest of the team is starting to buy into that mentality too.
They're 18-8. You mentioned they're much improved. Do you think they're ahead of schedule where they should be at, or you think they're on schedule? Where do you think they're at where you thought that maybe they would be at this point?
I think if you look at their strength of schedule, they face some tough competitors like Oklahoma and like some other like highly ranked teams. I would say, like, I'm not surprised. I think most people maybe just looking at last year, they were under 500 overall and only got 3 wins in conference play. Maybe you'd look at this year and be like, okay, we're only expecting an incremental improvement. But for me, just knowing everything that they went through and kind of the approach that Chelsea Spencer takes, I'm not that surprised with how they've been pacing so far. But the Pac-12 is a gauntlet, so it's going to be a tough, next couple of months.
It really is. Other Pac-12 series, the marquee ones, some would say, great tradition, of course, Arizona, UCLA, and Los Angeles. Tough way, though, for Caitlin Lowe. Welcome to the Pac-12. Her first Pac-12 series as head coach of Arizona comes in Los Angeles against UCLA.
I mean, it's the most classic matchup in softball, college softball, not just Pac-12, but the entire country. Like, it is the most classic. I remember in the 2010 Women's College World Series when Arizona and UCLA met up in the championship series, it was like, wow, we've seen this a few times before, haven't we? But I think with Caitlin Lowe, I mean, as you know, Eric, like I'm very excited about her being at the helm of Arizona and just the staff that she's built with Taryn Moat and Lauren Lappin, who are just both incredible. And I think, again, there's something to be said about having walked the path themselves. So for her, even though it's her first time doing this as a head coach, it's not her first time doing it in her life. She's very familiar with this rivalry as a player, but also as an assistant coach too. Like, she was there for years with Candrea. So it's more like she's maybe a little bit more in the spotlight now, but like she knows what to do, or she knows the approach that they should take. And that's really all you can control at the end of the day, is the approach that you take, whether you're a player or coach, whatever it is, because there's so many uncontrollables in this game. But I think, what better way to kick off Pac-12 play? Like, that's one of the most exciting series that there's going to be.
Feels strange to say this, but I feel like UCLA's quietly been under the radar since Clearwater. I already saw them in Clearwater. They dropped the game to Northwestern, lost that primetime game to Florida State. Since then, they've kind of been under the radar. They've been taking care of business, but they're still the team to beat in the Pac-12.
They are. And I would say they have been under the radar. And I think that's a mistake for anybody that has been buying into them being a little bit more under the radar, or maybe not talked about as much. That's a mistake, because even those games that you mentioned, like that primetime game, first of all, just outstanding coverage and visibility for the sport, but it was a close game. They're going extra innings here. Like, these weren't terrible losses necessarily. So like, they're competing. And then I have to look at also the way that they've bounced back since then. Megan Faremo has only gotten better since, with her back-to-back perfect games and like striking everyone out in the second game and like all the stats that you want to throw at it. But she, along with some of these returners like Brie Perez, they've been there as well. So I just think you can never count them out anyway, even if they're not coming off of like a 2019 national championship the way they are now. That's just not how they're built, especially when you have like a Lisa Fernandez on the staff, who's one of the most, first of all, the GOAT, right? But also one of the most intense people you'll ever meet. The story that sticks out to me is when Rachel Garcia came on, Believe in Softball, and she was talking about the champ camps that Lisa Fernandez used to run them through, and, putting on all the layers and just all the old school stuff, but that just gives you that grit. And I think they still have that. So I don't think you can ever count them out.
No, and they're quietly 22-3, and they're under the radar. And I think Kelly Inouye Perez quietly kind of likes the fact they're under the radar a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of, right? A little chip on the shoulder there over there.
Yeah.
For them. It's going to be fascinating to see Arizona UCLA, a young Arizona team too. That's going to be a big test for them going up there to Los Angeles. Another series, obviously in the Pac-12, Oregon State at Arizona State. Let's talk about the Beavers. Maybe the surprise of the Pac-12. Laura Berg maybe doing her best job of her career. 22-4. They're ranked in the top national polls in the top 25 with such a young team, Jenna. I mean, I talked to her before the season about a lot of new faces, a lot of freshmen and sophomores, but man, they're playing really well, but they're going to get tested. They go to Tempe to take on that Arizona State offense, which they've been kind of a little bit up and down. I'm really interested to see how Oregon State now looks in conference play after a fantastic start in a non-conference.
I'm really glad you brought them up because they're another one that fly under the radar. And the thing about it too is when you get to this kind of start that they're having right now, that didn't just magically happen this year. That's something that's been building up over the last few years. And I remember seeing Mariah Mazzone, for example, pitching against Stanford live last year, and I was very impressed with her. And even Coach Alistair was like, yeah, she's legit. Like, you cannot, just assume anything. And that's the thing with the Pac-12. You can't take any weekend off. You never have really been able to, because even if a team's struggling a little bit, like, they can always surprise you. And you look at like just across the board, there's been 5 teams that have been consistently ranked in the top 25 across different polls. And then there's 2 additional teams with Stanford and Oregon State that have started to get these votes for some of those polls. And then you have Cal and Utah, who, like, you can't just show up and think you're going to win. You have to bring your A game against those teams. So, and Laura Berg, I mean, you just look at the leadership. We've talked about the experience with some of these other coaches. Again, all female coaches in the Pac-12. 6 out of 9 are alums at their alma maters now. Laura Berg isn't one of them. She's from Fresno State, but she's played at the highest possible level you can. She's the most decorated USA softball player.
Oh, by the way.
Ever. Yeah. Like, hello, so these things all matter. Like, they trickle down from the top down. And I just think, like, they've always been scrappy from my experience playing against them too.
Well, and you mentioned her accolades as a player, but never, people don't talk about her as a coach. Corvallis, not the easiest place to get to, not the easiest place to, recruit necessarily. And I think this team has really surprised me, and they're ahead of schedule. They're young. Obviously, we'll see how they do in Pac-12 play, but they're in position to make the NCAA tournament here. Part of, if they can play well in the Pac-12. Obviously, this will be a big test on the road. It's a gauntlet, as you mentioned earlier, in the Pac-12. But I don't know if she's gotten the credit she deserves as a head coach, especially this year with the job. I mean, again, that's the youngest team in the league.
She hasn't gotten the credit. Definitely has not. And maybe to your point, kind of like Kelly it's like, maybe that's okay with her, because I don't think that's what she's in it for. I think she's in it to compete. But I think we, in our position and the community that surrounds softball, should give her that credit. And I mentioned pitching, but when you look offensively, like, Frankie Hamoudi was leading in multiple categories in the entire conference. And even in home runs, I think she was in the top 5 nationally at one point too, right? So it's both sides of the ball as well. And so I agree, she definitely needs more credit, but I can't wait to see what they do.
Yeah, she would be my Pac-12 pre-conference coach of the year. If we did if I made up an award of pre-conference, that would be my coach of the year in the Pac-12. There you go. I'm just creating awards.
I think that's a fair guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Your thoughts on Arizona State post-Hackbarth era there? They've had some, they're still talented. What's your thoughts on them here as they start conference?
I mean, their bats have been something that they've been able to rely on for the last several years. You talk about home runs, and it's just something that they've consistently been able to do. Not just the long ball, but just power hitting and just hitting well as a team. I think that's kept them in some games, because pitching, there's been some movement with pitching over the years. And also the transfer portal had been active over the last few years at Arizona State as well. But I think some of the consistencies have definitely been offensively. And I know Coach Ford gives a lot of credit to her staff for working with the hitters in that regard. And I think there's a lot of energy from ASU too. I actually used to love playing there, even though everyone's rooting against you. There's just something about the atmosphere that Sun Devil fans bring, and ASU as a team always collectively tends to bring that. And I think that makes a difference too, because even if you're struggling or if you're behind, the game's never really over. And to me, that's kind of what I think of when I think of ASU softball.
And then the other Pac-12 series of the weekend, Oregon at Utah. Oregon 19-3. They're playing great despite some adversity. Big news there. Brooke Giannis out for the year with an undisclosed injury. But Missy Lombardi just moving along, has other arms to step up, and here they are 19-3 going into Salt Lake to start conference play. What's your thoughts on the Ducks and the impact of the Giannis loss?
I mean, of course it's huge. Like, she was such a central part of the team, not just the pitching staff, right? And someone you talk about because she was a competitor. But this is, if you're a coach or if you're a player in this situation, the way you think about it is not as much that it's a detriment or a hindrance to what you're trying to do, which is right now play well in Pac-12 and win a Pac-12 championship, but also it's an opportunity for other people to step up. And the thing about it too is, like, we're not in that age of softball anymore where you can just have, one pitcher and ride that pitcher all the way anymore. Like, we're well past that. Hitting has really developed and the technology has gone through the roof to the point where you really can't. I mean, there are some that are outstanding. Like, you look at the Gabby Plains of the world, but even Heather Tarr's talking about, we're trying to develop the rest of the staff because you do have to have that support. So this is something where it's almost like same concept as you have to score to win. It's like, well, you have to have a staff to win as well. So I just think as long as they frame it that way and just keep doing what they're doing offensively, I think they scored like 31 runs in the next 3 games after they lost Giannis, right? Like, just keep with that mentality and they're going to be okay. They're going to be able to compete.
Sam Barter's done a nice job first year there, is running the offense there. That partly is a big part of it too for Oregon. Utah, they've got some battles. They could say they're the team that's held Oklahoma to the fewest runs this season at this point. Your thoughts on Amy Hogan, Utah? They got Paige Parker's the new pitching coach. They have a Gasso on the staff. Your thoughts on the Utes?
I think you just mentioned a few names there that also bring a ton of knowledge and experience to that program. Amy Hogue, another alum who's been at her alma mater for a while, but talk about energy. Like, when they turned that triple play against Oklahoma, obviously triple play is really rare, right? Like, but I'm a defensive purist, so I loved it. But just looking at Coach Hogue when that happened, before the play was even completely, the ball was completely in the first baseman's glove, she was out of the dugout, fired up for the team. And that's the kind of energy where it's yeah, we're in this. We're not playing the name game here. We don't care that it's Oklahoma. They've been in the Pac-12 now for 10 years. And this might be season 13, I think, with, if you count the COVID year, et cetera. But this is something where she just knows to compete. And a lot of their losses, they fight. These aren't, they fight in these losses. These are not, to your point, they held Oklahoma to, lower amount of runs than most teams that play them, right? And that's actually probably the scrappiest team in the Pac-12. I think a lot of teams are scrappy. I've mentioned that a couple of times with the Oregon States and things like that. But I remember when we played them my senior year, you could tell right out the gate when they joined the Pac-12 that they were going to compete every pitch. So again, that's a team where it's they could steal some games. You might think, oh, UCLA, they'll sweep Utah. You never know. They could take some games, it's, again, you just can't count them out.
And they're a team that probably will benefit down the road a year from now when there's going to be a Pac-12 tournament. This will be the last year where there's no Pac-12 tournament. I spoke to Coach Allister on the podcast in depth. She was a big proponent of it. She was pushing for it. She gave her reasons. What's now your thoughts now that you've kind of had some time to think about this Pac-12 tournament and the impact it's going to make down the road? It'll start next year. We don't know all the specifics yet as we talk, but this will be the last year where there is no Pac-12 tournament. And as Coach Allister told me, it will affect the schedule to some extent because obviously things get moved up a week.
It will affect the schedule. Like, for example, Pac-12 baseball has their tournament this year, and I was just calling the Oregon Stanford series last weekend, and it's the first time ever that they ever had to compete during dead week, which is leading up to finals week. Because, for example, Stanford, I believe Washington, some of the schools are on a quarter system.
Yep.
So that's just something to consider. It's never an excuse, and no coach would ever use it as an excuse, but it is context because we forget sometimes that these are student athletes, right? Like they have lives and things going on in school happening outside of the softball field. So it's something to consider, but I am excited for it for two big reasons. One, and this is something that all the Pac-12 coaches are very, very serious about, which is just more attention and deserved attention as well to the conference. And that happens a lot for like the SEC, the ACC, some of these other conferences through the tournament. And that's also the timing of it being before postseason, like right before, selection show Sunday and all of that good stuff. Like that's going to be important for attention and visibility. The other thing is I think that it helps prepare these teams for the postseason, both from a playing in a tournament type format perspective, as well as just that pressure that is postseason. And I think it's just something where one thing you have to keep in mind, which Coach Tar mentioned actually when I spoke to her, is like, well, but if you kind of lose right away, you could only play one game that weekend. So you have to like take those things into consideration because you want to get as many reps in as possible. But overall, I think in terms of marketing and in terms of preparing these teams for competition, like it's going to be great for the conference. I'm very excited.
It should be really, really exciting. Oh, you just threw in there. You just like, oh yeah, I just call the baseball series, Pac-12, Oregon, Stanford. A Stanford alum calling softball and baseball. Where have I heard that before? Huh.
Yeah. From Camarillo too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It all rings a bell. Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of rings a bell. That's pretty cool. You're doing that as well. Obviously, you cover Stanford. I have to ask you this. I talked to Coach Allister about it, but there was the weekend where Stanford threw not one, not two, but three straight no-hitters, including a perfect game. You were there. What was it
Yes.
like?
It was awesome. It had been, what was it? I think 9 years since the last perfect game. It had been that long, like 2013. And I think it had been maybe a couple years sooner than that for the no hitter. So it had been a long time, but I think the coolest part is that not only was it like, wow, 24 hours, there's three, no hitters, including the perfect game, but the fact that it was three different pitchers, that's exciting for the softball fans, for the media people like us, but even for me as an alum, it's something that within the last 10 years, it's been off and on having an actual staff in the circle and in the bullpen. We've had some great people like obviously Elena Votter has been leading the way for Stanford, but to be able to have like other pitchers be able to do that and perform and do it under pressure. And not only that, but on the offensive side, they had I think 4 or 5 run rules in a row that weekend. And the thing is like, sure, that it's not like they were playing at Mary Nutter, right? Or something like that at the time. However, they were playing some conference champions from last year from other conferences like the WAC and the WCC, et cetera. So they just did exactly what they were supposed to do. And it was both sides of the ball. And it just really like warmed my heart, especially Elena Votter. It's not necessarily a surprise. Reagan Krause had been someone who, that was bound to happen. Like she was just showing those signs over the last year and this year. But then Molly Millar, right? She's like a super senior basically. And she was able to do it too. And she's looking the best that I think she's looked in her whole career. And just being able to see Stanford pull all those different levers and have those different weapons in their bullpen has been really exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see once they get into conference play. Obviously, there'll be non-conference this weekend, but a lot of arms, very athletic Stanford team. As Coach Allister told me, the most athletic they've had since she's been here, arrived at Stanford. Part of a great storylines in the Pac-12. What's the biggest question as we get into Pac-12 conference play that you're excited, intrigued to learn the answer to as we get into conference play now?
That's a good question. I think my biggest question is basically like what's going to happen after, meaning, okay, the thing that happens in the Pac-12 every year, and we're not the only conference in that regard, but the thing that happens in the Pac-12 every year is that you beat each other up. And so because these are ranked teams and all these things, RPI, you end up sort of like hurting your RPI in the end. And last year with adding that fourth game, trying to get extra games in, but kind of hurting your RPI in the process, like obviously didn't work for the conference in terms of where they ended up based on the selection committee's decisions. So for me, it's how are they going to do, or how are they going to be recognized from their conference play and what they've done, their body of work this season going into the postseason? I think that's my biggest question in general about the conference. And then when it comes to just within conference play, I would just say, like, I don't think that the quote unquote rankings or the preseason poll, I don't think that's how it's going to end up at the end of conference play. Like, I think UCLA was picked to win it. And then there's like Arizona and Washington, and then Oregon and Arizona State, Stanford. And then there's like, Oregon, Cal, Utah, and things at the bottom. I just think it's going to be shaken up. So I'm just curious, like, how far off is it going to be, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I agree. I think we talked before the season on our season preview show. This could be a more kind of topsy-turvy here. We think Oregon and Stanford could both make some noise, even with the Giannis injury. They still seem, like you mentioned, with their talent, Stanford, and then Oregon State, which we didn't talk about as much in the preseason, the way they've looked. This could be one of the more dramatic Pac-12 seasons we've had in a while, from top to bottom, and could be a big year from a tournament bid standpoint, and of course, an exciting conference race. And it all gets going this weekend. Pac-12 coverage on Pac-12 Network will begin across all your affiliates, of course, including Washington at Cal. That's where Jenna is going to be with Amanda Freed, who we've also had on this show. Just tell us about what to expect on the coverage this weekend in Berkeley, and then also obviously promote your podcast.
Of course. Well, honestly, the most exciting part in some ways, other than just, I love doing this, and I know Amanda does too, is I haven't told her this yet too. My plan is to play it cool until the end, and then maybe I'll tell her this. But growing up in Southern California, and I was a pitcher and a shortstop, and I pitched even through freshman year at Stanford. And she was like, I love pitchers who hit, even to this day. I love talking about them on the broadcast. And she, like I said before, was kind of like one of the faces of that. And she was one of my favorites just growing up. I went to like some alumni games and watched them play each other and all that good stuff. And so to be able to do it with her now is one of those full circle moments. I felt the same way when I first interviewed like Natasha Watley on my show, and like some other people. And like, this feels like that. And I just think, given her experience too, it's going to be awesome. And it's not that often that you get to have two former players, like someone doing the play-by-play and someone doing the analyst role, who really get to talk the game, but that truly were there. Like, that doesn't happen that often. I think it'll start to happen more and more, but it's going to be a really fun conversation in that regard too. So I'm excited for that, as well as just like some good softball. And I think Cal's going to compete, and Washington obviously is on a roll, but they're taking them seriously as well. So I'm just excited for some good softball too.
Yeah,
but
it's gonna be exciting.
Yeah. And in terms of the podcast, yes, Believe in Softball. It's BLEAV. If you're on the YouTube, you can see it on my shirt. You follow us, Believe in Softball, on Instagram and Twitter, and then you can get it anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, all those things, as well as YouTube. So subscribe, follow us, do all the things.
Well, we're excited to see you on the Pac-12 Network, including Vic, who his birthday was on Wednesday. Jenna, you got to get him a birthday shout out here before we we toss it back to to him there.
Happy birthday, Victor. I did give him one of the like old school right on the Facebook wall.
You have to.
Happy birthdays earlier. I had to do it because it's not really official until you do something like that. But I'm happy to do it here too. Happy birthday. Wishing you all the best things this next year.
That's right. He's a subscriber to your podcast. He's looking forward to the Tori Tyson interview, and looking forward to seeing you on the Pac-12 Network, Jenna. Thanks again for taking time. I know it's a busy week. You're getting prepared for the broadcast. Have a great broadcast and a great season, and we'll definitely talk to you down the road this season.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks. Always love being on here. Appreciate it.